My name is Officer Michael Hayes, and I've been serving the Millbrook Police Department for exactly 20 years, 3 months, and 14 days. And I'm going to confess something to you that I've never told anyone before. After this particular case, I went to therapy for 6 months. Not because the department required it, though they did, but because what I witnessed that night truly shook me to my very core. It challenged everything I thought I knew about reality, about what's possible in this world, and about the thin line between sanity and madness. It was October 15th, 2019, a cold Tuesday evening in our small town of Millbrook, Massachusetts. Population 8,507 according to the last census, nestled between rolling hills covered in maple and oak trees that were just beginning to turn their brilliant autumn colors, and dense pine forests that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness beyond our town limits. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, where the biggest crime is usually teenagers spray painting obscenities on the old water tower, or someone stealing newspapers from their neighbor's driveway because they're too cheap to buy their own subscription. I'd been working the evening shift that night, 4 p.m. to midnight, cruising the quiet residential streets in my patrol car, Unit 47, a 2017 Ford Police Interceptor with 127,000 miles on it, and a tendency to pull slightly to the left when you hit the brakes too hard. The fog was rolling in thick from the nearby Blackwood Forest, that massive expanse of pine and birch trees that forms the eastern border of our town, and the streetlights were barely cutting through the growing darkness. It was the kind of night that made you want to stay indoors with a hot cup of coffee, maybe some Irish whiskey in it, and a good book by Stephen King or Dean Koontz. The temperature had dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing, and my breath was visible every time I stepped out of the patrol car. The Weather Service had issued a frost warning for our county, and most sensible people were already tucked away in their warm houses, probably watching the Tuesday night lineup on television or helping their kids with homework. At exactly 9:47 p.m., I remember the time precisely because I was looking at my watch when the call came in, wondering if the rest of my shift would be as quiet as the first 5 hours had been. The radio crackled to life with that familiar burst of static that always made me jump a little, no matter how many times I heard it. Unit 47, this is dispatch. We have a domestic disturbance call at 1247 Elmwood Street. Multiple neighbors have called in reports of screaming and what they describe as strange noises coming from the residents. Please respond immediately and approach with caution. Be advised, we've had several complaints about this address over the past month. The voice belonged to Jenny Martinez, our night dispatcher, a grandmother of 4 who'd been working the police department's radio for the past 15 years. Jenny had a calm, professional manner that could soothe even the most agitated caller, but tonight there was something different in her voice. A tension I'd never heard before, like she was reading from a script but didn't quite believe the words she was saying. I keyed my radio. Unit 47 to dispatch, I copy. 1247 Elmwood Street, domestic disturbance with unknown nature of strange noises. ETA approximately 5 minutes. Copy that, Unit 47. Please report your status once you've assessed the situation. I'd been to that address before, more times than I cared to count over the past 3 years. The Whitman House, a towering Victorian mansion built in 1892, according to the Historical Society's records, with 3 stories, a wraparound porch, and enough architectural details to make it the kind of house that real estate agents would describe as full of character. But the character had been fading for years. The paint was peeling in long strips, revealing the gray, weathered wood underneath, and several of the ornate shutters hung at odd angles or were missing entirely. The house sat on nearly 2 acres of land, surrounded by massive oak trees that were probably 100 years old, their gnarled branches creating a canopy so thick that even in broad daylight, the house seemed to exist in perpetual twilight. It was the kind of house that looked like it belonged in a Stephen King novel rather than on a quiet residential street in small-town Massachusetts. The kind of place that children dared each other to approach on Halloween night. Tom Whitman had lived there alone since his wife Margaret passed away from pancreatic cancer 3 years, 2 months, and 6 days ago. I remembered the exact timing, because I'd been one of the officers who'd responded when Tom called 911 that morning, hysterical and barely coherent, saying that Margaret wouldn't wake up and he didn't know what to do. By the time the paramedics arrived, she'd been dead for several hours, probably peacefully in her sleep, which was a blessing considering how much pain the cancer had caused her in those final months. Tom was 62 years old, a retired machinist who had worked at the Millbrook paper mill for 35 years before it closed down in 2003, taking with it nearly 400 jobs and leaving our town's economy in shambles. He was about 5 feet 8 inches tall, maybe 160 pounds soaking wet, with thinning gray hair and the kind of deep lines around his eyes that come from decades of squinting at precision machinery in poorly lit factory buildings. After Margaret died, Tom became increasingly reclusive, barely leaving the house except for weekly grocery runs to the IGA supermarket and monthly visits to Dr. Patterson for his blood pressure medication and the antidepressants that he'd been prescribed after Margaret's funeral. I'd responded to several wellness checks over the past 3 years, usually called in by Mrs. Eleanor Patterson from next door, no relation to the doctor, when she hadn't seen Tom for several days and became worried that he might have fallen or had a medical emergency. But lately, the calls about the Whitman house had been different. Instead of wellness checks, we were getting complaints about noise, loud banging sounds at all hours of the night, scraping noises like furniture being dragged across floors, and what Mrs. Patterson described as sounds like someone crying, but not quite right, like it's coming from an animal instead of a person, but not any animal I've ever heard before. She'd called the station 6 times in the past month, always between midnight and 3 a.m., always reporting the same type of disturbances. Each time, whoever was on duty would drive by the house, see that all the lights were off and everything appeared normal from the outside, and mark it down as a possible case of Mrs. Patterson's imagination running wild. She was 73 years old and lived alone since her husband Frank passed away 2 years ago, and everyone just assumed she was hearing things that weren't really there, maybe dealing with some age-related hearing issues that were causing her to misinterpret ordinary household sounds. But tonight was different. Tonight we'd received calls from 4 different neighbors within a span of 20 minutes. Mrs. Patterson, of course, but also the Hendersons from across the street, the Johnsons from 2 houses down, and even old Mr. Kowalski from 3 blocks away, who claimed he could hear the screaming from his back porch, even with his hearing aids turned off. As I pulled up to 1247 Elmwood Street, everything seemed normal at first glance. The house loomed against the cloudy night sky like a massive shadow, its Victorian silhouette casting long twisted shadows across the overgrown front lawn. The grass hadn't been cut in weeks and was nearly knee-high in some places, dotted with dandelions that had gone to seed and scattered with fallen leaves from the massive oak trees that surrounded the property. The porch light was on, creating a weak circle of yellow illumination that barely reached the front steps, which were wooden and creaked ominously even when no one was walking on them. Tom's old Ford F-150 pickup truck, forest green with rust spots along the wheel wells and a cracked windshield, was parked in its usual spot in the gravel driveway, same place it had been sitting for the past several weeks. The truck looked like it hadn't been moved in a long time. There were leaves scattered across the hood and roof, and the tires looked slightly flat. But as I stepped out of my patrol car, turning off the engine and pocketing the keys, I felt it immediately. That unshakable feeling that something was terribly, horribly wrong. It was like walking into an invisible spider web that you couldn't see but could feel clinging to your skin. That tingling sensation that makes every hair on your body stand up and sends a chill down your spine that has nothing to do with the cold October air. The silence was the first thing I noticed. It was too quiet, unnaturally quiet in a way that made my ears ring. No insects chirping, no wind rustling through the massive oak trees that surrounded the property, no distant sound of traffic from the main road half a mile away. Even my footsteps on the gravel driveway seemed muffled, as if the very atmosphere was absorbing sound like a sponge soaking up water. In my 20 years of police work, I'd learned to trust my instincts above all else. That little voice in the back of your head that tells you when something isn't right, when you need to be extra careful, when you should call for backup even if you can't articulate exactly why you feel threatened. And right now, every fiber of my being was screaming danger, telling me to get back in my patrol car and wait for backup to arrive before approaching the house. But I had a job to do. 4 different neighbors had called in reports of disturbances, and it was my responsibility to investigate and ensure that everyone was safe. I approached the front door, my right hand instinctively checking the position of my service weapon. A Glock 22 .40 caliber pistol that I'd carried for the past 15 years, and thankfully had never been forced to fire in the line of duty, though I'd qualified expert with it at the range every 6 months without fail. The wooden porch creaked and groaned under my weight as I stepped up to the front door, which was painted dark green but was peeling badly, revealing layers of previous paint jobs in different colors underneath. There was a brass knocker in the shape of a lion's head, tarnished with age, and a doorbell button that looked like it hadn't worked in years. I knocked firmly on the door with my knuckles, the sound echoing hollowly from inside the house. "Mr. Whitman, this is Officer Hayes from the Millbrook Police Department. We received some complaints about noise coming from your residence tonight. Is everything all right in there? I need to speak with you, sir." Silence. Complete, absolute silence that seemed to press against my eardrums like cotton balls stuffed deep in my ears. The kind of silence that makes you wonder if you've suddenly gone deaf, if your hearing has just completely failed without warning. I waited 30 seconds, counting them off in my head, then knocked again, harder this time, using the brass knocker instead of my knuckles. The metal was ice cold against my skin, far colder than it should have been given the October temperature. "Sir, this is the police. I need to speak with you right now. Please open the door so we can resolve this matter and I can make sure you're okay." That's when I heard it. A low, rhythmic, thumping sound coming from somewhere deep inside the house. Like someone pounding on a wall with their fist, over and over again in a steady pattern that never varied. Thump, thump, thump. Each impact seemed to vibrate through the old wooden structure of the house, and I could feel it as much as hear it, like a bass drum being played in a distant room. But there was something else mixed in with the thumping, something that made my skin crawl and my stomach turn with a mixture of fear and disgust. It was whimpering, definitely human whimpering, the kind of sound someone makes when they're in terrible pain or overwhelming fear, but with an odd quality to it that I couldn't quite identify. Like the sound was being filtered through water, or coming from very far away, or being produced by vocal cords that weren't quite human anymore. I tried the door handle, a brass knob that matched the knocker and was just as cold to the touch. Locked, as I'd expected. The whimpering was getting more frantic now, rising and falling in pitch like someone was trying to scream but couldn't quite manage it, like their throat was damaged or blocked somehow. That's when I made the decision to investigate the property more thoroughly. Under Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 276, Section 1, if a police officer has probable cause to believe that someone inside a residence is in immediate danger of serious bodily harm, they have the authority to enter that residence without a warrant to provide assistance and ensure public safety. I keyed my radio, speaking quietly so that if there was someone inside who meant harm to Tom Whitman, they wouldn't hear me calling for backup. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I'm at 1247 Elmwood Street and I can hear sounds of distress coming from inside the residence. Sounds like someone might be injured or in danger. I'm going to investigate the premises more thoroughly. Please have backup units en route to my location as a precaution." "Copy that, Unit 47. Jenny Martinez's voice crackled back through the radio. "Backup is approximately 8 to 10 minutes out. Units 23 and 31 are responding to your location. Be careful out there, Michael." Jenny never used first names over the radio. It was against department protocol. But I could hear the genuine concern in her voice, and somehow that made me feel even more uneasy about the situation I was walking into. I walked around to the back of the house, my flashlight cutting through the thick fog that was rolling in from the forest. The beam seemed weaker than usual, barely penetrating more than 10 or 15 feet into the murky darkness. The backyard was a disaster area. Overgrown weeds, nearly waist-high, scattered garbage bags that had been torn open by raccoons or other animals, their contents spread across the yard like the remnants of some bizarre outdoor feast. There was an old tire swing hanging from one of the massive oak trees. The rope frayed and the tire rotted, swaying slightly in what should have been perfectly still air. A rusted lawnmower sat abandoned near the back porch, covered in so many fallen leaves that it looked like some kind of strange garden sculpture. The back porch itself was sagging badly, the wooden steps warped and several of the support posts leaning at dangerous angles. But what immediately caught my attention was the basement window on the back wall of the house, about 3 feet off the ground and partially hidden by overgrown bushes. It was broken, with jagged pieces of glass scattered on the ground outside. The break pattern suggested that the glass had been shattered from the inside, as if someone or something had tried to escape through the window and had smashed it in their desperation to get out. The whimpering was much louder now, definitely coming from the basement, and I could hear it clearly through the broken window, but it had changed somehow in the few minutes since I'd first heard it. It had become more urgent, more desperate, with an edge of panic that made my heart race and my palms sweat despite the cold air. And underneath the whimpering I could hear something else. A scratching sound, rhythmic and persistent, like fingernails being dragged across wood in long, deliberate strokes. Scratch, 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 pause. Scratch, 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 pause. The pattern never varied, never stopped, never slowed down or sped up. I squeezed through the broken window, my uniform catching on the remaining glass shards and tearing slightly. The basement was immediately colder than the outside air, at least 10 degrees colder, and my breath came out in visible puffs as soon as I was inside. The temperature difference was so dramatic that it felt like stepping into a walk-in freezer. But it wasn't just the cold that was wrong about the basement. It smelled wrong too, not just musty or damp like most basements in old houses, but with an underlying odor that I recognized immediately from my years of police work. It was the smell of death, that sweet, cloying, organic stench that comes from decomposing flesh. But mixed in with it was something else, something chemical and sharp that reminded me of the morgue at County General Hospital, that mixture of formaldehyde and disinfectant that funeral homes use to preserve bodies. My flashlight beam swept across the cluttered space, revealing a basement that looked like it hadn't been cleaned or organized in years. Old furniture covered with dust sheets that had turned gray with cardboard boxes stacked against the walls with their contents spilling out, and what looked like workshop equipment scattered around in no particular order. There were cobwebs everywhere, thick and dusty, some of them spanning the entire width of the basement like Halloween decorations. But there was light coming from behind a partition wall made of old plywood sheets, the flickering, unsteady light of candles, or perhaps an old kerosene lantern. The light danced and wavered, casting moving shadows on the concrete walls that looked almost abyss in the unstable illumination. "Hello, this is the Millbrook Police Department. Is someone down here who needs assistance? Mr. Whitman, are you down here? I'm here to help." The whimpering stopped abruptly, as if someone had suddenly clamped their hand over their mouth or had been startled into silence by the sound of my voice. The scratching sound continued for a few more seconds, then it too fell silent, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and the rapid beating of my heart. I moved toward the light, my boots crunching on broken glass and debris that covered the basement floor. Each step seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, echoing off the concrete walls and ceiling. As I rounded the partition wall, stepping carefully over what looked like the remains of an old workbench that had been smashed to pieces, I saw him. Tom Whitman was standing in the corner of the basement, about 8 feet away from me, facing the wall like a child who'd been put in timeout. He was completely motionless, so still that for a moment I wondered if he was even breathing. His posture was rigid, unnatural, like someone standing at military attention but somehow wrong, as if his joints had locked into position and couldn't bend anymore. He was wearing the same clothes I'd seen him in the last time I'd done a wellness check on him about 2 weeks ago. A faded blue work shirt with Millbrook Paper Mill embroidered on the pocket, and dark blue jeans that had seen better days. But the clothes were filthy now, stained with something dark that could have been mud or grease or something much worse. The stains were everywhere, on his shirt, his pants, even in his gray hair, which looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. In front of him, illuminated by at least a dozen candles arranged in what looked like a deliberate pattern, was a makeshift workbench constructed from an old door laid across 2 sawhorses. The candles were of different heights and thicknesses, some nearly burned down to stubs, others tall and new, their flames dancing in the stagnant basement air and filling the space with the smell of melted wax mixed with that underlying odor of death and chemicals. But I couldn't see what was on the workbench from my position behind Tom. All I could make out was that there were objects arranged on the surface, things that caught the candlelight and reflected it back in ways that made my stomach churn with anticipation of something horrible. "Mr. Whitman, sir, I'm Officer Hayes. We've met before. I've been to your house several times over the past few years to check on you. I need you to turn around slowly and show me your hands so I can see that you're not injured and don't have any weapons." He didn't move, didn't even acknowledge that I had spoken. It was like he couldn't hear me, or like he was so deeply focused on whatever was in front of him that the rest of the world had ceased to exist. I'd dealt with people in various states of mental distress during my career. People under the influence of drugs or alcohol, people having psychotic episodes, people suffering from dementia or other cognitive impairments. But I'd never encountered anyone who was so completely unresponsive to the presence of a uniformed police officer. I took a step closer, my heart beginning to pound in my chest, hard enough that I could hear it in my ears. The candlelight flickered across Tom's profile, and I could see that his eyes were open, staring at something on the workbench with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. His mouth was slightly open too, and I thought I could see saliva or some other fluid dripping from the corner of his lips. "Sir, I need you to respond to me right now. This is the police, and I'm here to help you. Turn around and put your hands where I can see them. I'm not going to hurt you, but I need to make sure you're okay and that you're not a danger to yourself or others." That's when he started to turn around, but something was fundamentally wrong with the way he moved. It was too slow, too deliberate, too mechanical, like his joints were rusted or like he was moving underwater against tremendous resistance. There was no fluidity to it, no natural human movement. It was like watching a mannequin being turned by some invisible hand, 1 degree at a time. The process seemed to take forever. First, his shoulders began to rotate, then his torso, then his hips, all moving together as one rigid unit instead of the natural, flowing movement you'd expect from a human being turning around. His head was the last thing to move, and when it finally began to turn in my direction, I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold basement air. When he finally faced me completely, I nearly dropped my flashlight and ran screaming from that basement. His eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils dilated from drugs or shock, the entire visible portion of both eyes, from corner to corner, was a deep, unnatural black that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight and the candles rather than reflect it. It was like looking into two holes that had been punched straight through his skull into an endless void. Two windows into some dimension where light couldn't exist. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was his mouth. His mouth was hanging open in a slack-jawed grimace that suggested he had no control over his facial muscles anymore. I could see inside, and what I saw made my stomach lurch with revulsion and terror. His tongue was gone. Not cut out or injured or swollen. Completely gone, as if it had never existed. The inside of his mouth was just a dark, empty cavity, but not the normal pink and red colors you'd expect. It was black, the same impossible black as his eyes, and it seemed to go much deeper than any human mouth should go, like I was looking down into some kind of tunnel or well. But he was still making noise. That whimpering sound was coming from him, emanating from somewhere deep in his chest or throat, but his mouth wasn't moving at all. The sound seemed to be produced by some internal mechanism that had nothing to do with normal human vocal cords or respiratory system. It was like the whimpering was coming from something living inside him, something that had taken up residence in his body and was using it as a vessel. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, taking an involuntary step backward and nearly tripping over a piece of broken furniture. That's when I got a clear view of what was on the workbench behind him, and my stomach lurched so violently that I thought I was going to vomit right there on the basement floor. It was skin. Human skin, carefully peeled away from bodies in large sections and arranged in neat squares like a quilter preparing fabric for a project. The pieces were pinned to a large corkboard with push pins, and each piece had been labeled with what looked like black permanent marker. Left arm, male, approx 40. Right shoulder, female, approx 25. Back section, 3. Child, approx 8. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the skin looked fresh, recently removed, still glistening with moisture in the candlelight. Some pieces still had blood clinging to them, dark red stains that hadn't had time to dry completely. And there was so much of it, far more than could have come from a single human body. The corkboard was completely covered, and there were additional pieces laid out on the workbench surface itself, arranged in careful rows like specimens in a laboratory. Next to the corkboard was a collection of tools that I recognized from crime scene photos I'd studied during my training. Skinning knives of various sizes, scissors, scalpels, and other implements that would be used to remove flesh from bone with precision and care. All of the tools were stained with dried blood and bits of tissue, and they were arranged with the same obsessive neatness as the skin samples. I reached for my radio with hands that were shaking so badly I could barely operate the controls. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I need backup at 1247 Elmwood Street immediately. Multiple units, ambulance, and state police detectives. I've got a situation here that's going to require specialists." "Unit 47, what's your exact situation? You sound distressed. Do you need immediate medical assistance?" I couldn't find the words to describe what I was seeing. How do you tell dispatch that you're standing in a basement with a man whose eyes have turned completely black and who appears to be collecting human skin like some kind of grotesque hobby? How do you explain over a police radio that you've stumbled into what looks like the workshop of a serial killer, except the killer doesn't appear to be entirely human anymore? "Just send everything you've got," I managed to say, my voice cracking with strain and fear. "Multiple units, ambulance, crime scene specialists, and get Detective Rodriguez on the phone right now. This is beyond anything I've dealt with before." "Copy that, Unit 47. All available units are en route to your location. ETA 3 to 4 minutes for the first responders." That's when Tom Whitman started moving toward me. But he wasn't walking. His feet weren't touching the basement floor. He was gliding across the concrete surface, floating about 2 inches above the ground, his body maintaining that unnaturally rigid posture as he moved. There was no effort involved, no muscle movement, no shifting of weight from one foot to the other. He simply moved through the air toward me like he was being pulled by some invisible force. The whimpering sound was getting louder and more frantic, and now I could hear something else mixed in with it. A clicking noise that was rapid and irregular, like someone tapping Morse code with their fingernails on a hard surface. But the sound was coming from inside Tom's chest or throat, not from his hands, which hung motionless at his sides. I drew my weapon, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely keep the gun steady. "Stop right there. Don't come any closer. I'm a police officer and I will use force if necessary to protect myself." He kept coming, that horrible clicking sound getting faster and more frantic with each second. I could smell something now that was far worse than the odors I detected when I first entered the basement. It was the stench of rotting meat mixed with something chemical and sharp, like the formaldehyde they use in funeral homes, but underneath it was something else, something that smelled like sulfur and burnt metal, and things that had been dead for far too long. The smell was so strong and so wrong that it made my eyes water and my throat burn. I had to fight the urge to gag, forcing myself to keep my weapon trained on the figure floating toward me. "I said stop. Stop right now. I don't want to hurt you, but I will if you don't stop moving." But Tom Whitman, or whatever was wearing Tom Whitman's body like a suit, showed no signs of stopping or even acknowledging my commands. The clicking sound was coming from his mouth now, even though his jaw wasn't moving, and I could see that his tongue was still missing. It was like the sound was being produced by some mechanism deep in his throat, something that had nothing to do with normal human anatomy, and those black eyes never blinked, never looked away from mine. They were fixed on me with an intensity that was beyond human, beyond predatory, beyond anything I had ever experienced. It was like being stared at by something that saw me not as a person but as an object, something to be studied and catalogued and eventually added to the collection on the workbench. He was only about 4 feet away from me now, close enough that I could see him more clearly in the flickering candlelight. His skin had a grayish, waxy appearance, like he'd been dead for several days. There were dark veins visible beneath the surface, creating a web-like pattern across his face and neck that pulsed slowly, as if something thick and dark was flowing through them instead of blood. His fingernails had grown long since I'd last seen him, at least 2 inches long, and they were caked with something brown and crusty that could have been dried blood or dirt, or something much worse. The nails themselves had turned black, the same impossible black as his eyes, and they curved slightly like claws. I fired a warning shot into the ceiling, the gunshot deafening in the confined space of the basement. Chunks of concrete and old wood rained down from above, and my ears immediately started ringing from the noise. But Tom Whitman didn't even flinch. He didn't show any reaction to the gunshot at all. No startled response, no change in his expression, no alteration in his steady approach toward me. "This isn't real," I whispered to myself, hoping that saying it out loud would somehow make it true. "This can't be real. People don't float. People's eyes don't turn black. This has to be some kind of hallucination or nightmare." But it was real. Whatever was standing in front of me, whatever was wearing Tom Whitman's face and body was absolutely, undeniably real. I could feel the cold radiating from its skin, could smell the death and chemicals emanating from its pores, could hear that inhuman clicking sound getting louder and more urgent with each passing second. He was less than 3 feet away now, close enough that I could have reached out and touched him if I'd wanted to, which I absolutely did not want to do. I had no choice. I fired directly at him, aiming for center mass just as I'd been trained to do. The bullet hit him in the chest, and he stumbled backwards slightly, but there was no blood. Instead, something dark and thick began oozing from the wound, flowing down the front of his shirt like motor oil. But it wasn't oil. It had an organic quality to it, like it was alive, and it moved with a purpose that suggested intelligence. The dark fluid had an odor all its own, something that made the existing smells in the basement seem pleasant by comparison. It was the smell of things that should never exist, of organic matter that had been transformed into something fundamentally wrong, of life twisted into shapes that violated every natural law. And Tom Whitman just kept coming. I fired again, then again, each bullet finding its mark but producing the same result, more of that dark, viscous fluid flowing from the wounds, but no apparent damage that would stop his advance. The fluid was pooling on the basement floor now, and I could see that it wasn't just flowing. It was moving with intention, spreading out in patterns that looked almost like symbols or writing in some alien language. That's when I heard footsteps upstairs. Heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth across the floor above us, moving from room to room with purpose. The old wooden floorboards creaked and groaned with each step, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the clicking sound coming from Tom Whitman's throat. But that was impossible. Tom Whitman was right in front of me. If he was down here in the basement, who or what was walking around upstairs? The whimpering sound suddenly stopped. Tom Whitman tilted his head to one side, like a dog listening to a sound only he could hear. The clicking from his throat became more rapid, almost frantic, like he was trying to communicate with whatever was upstairs. Then he opened his mouth. He opened it impossibly wide, far wider than any human mouth should be able to open. I could see that his jaw had somehow dislocated or transformed, allowing him to gape like a snake unhinging its jaw to swallow prey. And inside that cavernous opening, I could see rows of teeth that definitely hadn't been there before. Sharp, pointed teeth like a shark's, arranged in multiple rows that went back into his throat farther than should have been possible. The inside of his mouth glowed with a faint, sickly green light that illuminated the basement more brightly than the candles. And from that impossible opening came sounds that no human throat could ever produce. A combination of screaming and roaring and something that sounded like the grinding of metal against stone. And then he screamed. It wasn't a human scream. It was something primal and alien, something that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself, or from some dimension where sound followed different rules than it did in our world. The volume was impossible. So loud that I felt like my eardrums were going to burst. So loud that the concrete walls of the basement seemed to vibrate in response. But it wasn't just the volume that was wrong. It was the quality of the sound, the way it seemed to bypass my ears and go straight into my brain, creating sensations and emotions that had nothing to do with normal hearing. It was the sound of pure rage and hunger, and something else, something that wanted to tear me apart, not just physically but spiritually, something that wanted to consume every piece of me and add it to its collection. The scream went on and on, far longer than any human could sustain it, and I realized that whatever was producing the sound didn't need to breathe the way humans do. It was like listening to a machine designed specifically to create the most terrifying sound possible, calibrated to trigger every fear response that evolution had built into the human nervous system. I turned and ran. I scrambled back toward the broken window, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled over debris and broken furniture. Behind me, I could hear that inhuman screaming getting closer, and underneath it, the sound of something heavy crashing into the makeshift workbench. Candles went out, plunging sections of the basement into darkness that seemed to move and writhe like it was alive. I could hear the corkboard hitting the floor, pins scattering across the concrete, and the wet sound of the skin samples sliding around in the darkness. But worse than any of that was the sound of footsteps. Not Tom Whitman's floating movement, but actual footsteps. Multiple sets of them, coming down the basement stairs behind me. I dove through the broken window, cutting myself on the remaining glass shards. Sharp pieces sliced through my uniform and into my arms and chest, and I could feel warm blood running down my skin. But the pain was nothing compared to the terror driving me forward. I rolled onto the ground outside and kept running, not stopping until I reached my patrol car. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the key in the ignition, and when I finally managed to start the engine, I had to fight every instinct that was screaming at me to drive away as fast as possible and never look back. But I was a police officer, and there were protocols to follow, procedures to observe. Even in the face of something that defied every rational explanation. I could hear sirens in the distance. Backup was finally coming, but as I looked back at the basement window, trying to catch my breath and process what I had just experienced, I saw Tom Whitman's face pressed against the glass from the inside. Those black eyes were staring right at me, unblinking, and that clicking sound was still echoing from inside the house, now accompanied by what sounded like scratching, like fingernails being dragged across the interior walls in long, deliberate strokes. But there was something else now, something that made my blood freeze in my veins. There were other faces at other windows throughout the house. Pale faces with the same black eyes, the same slack expressions pressed against the glass, and all staring at me with that same inhuman intensity. I counted at least 6 different faces, maybe more, all of them wearing expressions of hunger and malevolence that made Tom Whitman look almost benign by comparison. Within minutes, the quiet residential street was filled with police cars, an ambulance, and a fire truck. The flashing red and blue lights created a surreal carnival atmosphere that seemed completely at odds with the horror I had just escaped. Lieutenant Rodriguez was the first to reach me, taking one look at my face and the blood on my arms, and immediately calling for the paramedics. "Hayes, what the hell happened in there? You look like you've seen a ghost, and you're bleeding pretty badly. Did someone attack you?" I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out in any coherent order. How could I tell him what I had witnessed? How could I explain that Tom Whitman was somehow still alive despite being shot multiple times and that his eyes had turned completely black? How could I describe the floating, the inhuman screaming, the collection of human skin arranged like fabric samples, the impossible anatomy of his transformed mouth? "There's someone in the basement," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "Tom Whitman. But something's wrong with him. Really, really wrong. He's dangerous, and there are others. I saw others in the windows. Don't go in there alone, Lieutenant. Please. Call for more backup. Call for specialists. Call for someone who knows how to deal with whatever that thing is." Rodriguez studied my face with the expression of someone trying to determine if he was dealing with an officer who had been injured in the line of duty or an officer who was having some kind of psychological breakdown. I could see the concern in his eyes, but also the skepticism, the natural resistance that any rational person would have to believing what I was trying to tell him. "Okay, Hayes, just take it easy. Take it. We're going to get you checked out by the paramedics, and then we'll handle whatever's in that house. You said you saw Tom Whitman in the basement." "Yes, but he's not human anymore." His eyes are completely black, and he was floating above the floor. And when I shot him, this dark stuff came out instead of blood, and his mouth opened wider than any human mouth should be able to open. And he screamed with a voice that couldn't have come from a human throat. I could see Rodriguez's expression changing as I spoke, shifting from concern to alarm to something that looked like pity. He was starting to think that I had suffered some kind of head injury or psychological break, that I was hallucinating or delusional. "Michael," he said, using my first name in a way that immediately told me he was shifting into crisis management mode. "I need you to slow down and take some deep breaths. You've been through some kind of trauma, and your mind might be playing tricks on you. Let's get you medical attention, and then we'll sort out what actually happened in that house." Rodriguez and 3 other officers, Sergeant Martinez, Officer Thompson, and Officer Williams, entered the house through the front door while I waited outside, being treated by EMT Sarah Chen for the cuts on my arms and chest. The glass had made some fairly deep gashes, and Sarah was concerned about possible nerve damage, but I couldn't focus on what she was saying. All I could think about was those black eyes staring at me through the basement window, and the knowledge that my fellow officers were walking into something that could tear them apart without effort. I could see their flashlights moving through the house, visible through the windows as they systematically searched each room. They spent a long time on the first floor, checking every closet and corner, then moved upstairs to the second floor and eventually the attic. The basement took them longer than the other areas, and I could see the beams of their flashlights moving around down there for what felt like an eternity. My radio crackled with their communications as they searched, and I could hear the confusion and growing frustration in their voices. "This is Rodriguez. First floor is clear. No signs of anyone here. The place looks like it's been empty for a while. Dust on everything, mail piled up by the front door. Thompson here. Second floor clear. Bedrooms look like they haven't been used in weeks. Beds not made, clothes scattered around, but no signs of recent occupancy. Williams reporting, attic is clear, just old furniture and storage boxes, no signs of disturbance. Sergeant Martinez, I'm in the basement now. It's a mess down here, old furniture, broken glass from the window that Officer Hayes came through, but I'm not seeing any workbench or candles or anything like what he described." I grabbed my radio with hands that were still shaking. "Sergeant Martinez, check the corner. The far corner behind the partition wall. That's where the workbench was set up with all the evidence. Hayes, I'm looking at the corner right now. There's no partition wall down here. Just the main basement area and a utility room with the water heater and furnace. And no workbench. Check for the skin samples. The corkboard with the human skin pinned to it. It was right there. I saw it clearly. Son, there's nothing like that down here. Just some old boxes and broken furniture. Are you sure you were in this basement?" 20 minutes later, when they finally came back outside, Rodriguez approached me with an expression that mixed concern with something that looked like disappointment. Behind him, the other officers were shaking their heads and speaking in low voices among themselves. "Hayes, we've been through that entire house 3 times. Basement, first floor, second floor, attic, even checked the crawl spaces and the small storage room under the front porch. There's no one in there. The place looks like it's been empty for weeks, maybe longer." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What about the candles, the workbench, the tools, the human skin arranged on the corkboard? Michael, there were no candles anywhere in that house. No workbench, no tools, no corkboard, and definitely no human skin. The basement is just a typical unfinished basement with some old furniture and storage boxes." I insisted on going back inside with them, against their better judgment, against the protests of the EMT, who wanted to take me to the hospital for a more thorough examination, and against every rational voice in my head that was telling me not to go back into that house, I demanded to see the basement again. It was exactly as Rodriguez had described. Just an empty basement with concrete walls, a concrete floor, and scattered furniture covered with dust sheets. No workbench, no candles, no partition wall, no evidence of the horror I had witnessed just an hour earlier. The corner where I had seen Tom Whitman standing was just an empty space with a couple of cardboard boxes stacked against the wall. But I could still smell it, that mixture of rotting meat and formaldehyde and something else, something organic and wrong. The odor was fainter now, but it was still there, lingering in the air like the memory of a terrible dream. You see these stains on the floor? I pointed to several dark spots on the concrete. That's where he was bleeding. That dark stuff that came out of him when I shot him. Officer Thompson knelt down and examined the stains with his flashlight, scraping at them with his fingernail. Hayes, these look like old oil stains, probably from when this basement was used as a workshop years ago. They're completely dry, been here for a long time. And they're not blood, wrong color, wrong consistency. What about the bullet holes? I fired my weapon multiple times. There should be bullet holes in the walls, shell casings on the floor. Sergeant Martinez had been looking around while Thompson examined the stains. I found 3 shell casings over by the stairs, and there are bullet holes in the ceiling where you said you fired a warning shot. But Michael, there's no evidence that you shot at anything else. The walls are intact, no bullet holes anywhere except the ceiling. I was losing my mind. I knew what I had seen. I knew what had happened in that basement. The floating figure, the black eyes, the impossible mouth full of shark teeth. The workbench covered with human skin samples. It had all been real as anything I had ever experienced. But there was no evidence, no proof, nothing to support my account of what had occurred except my own testimony, and even I was beginning to doubt my own sanity. The next morning, after a sleepless night spent staring at the ceiling of my bedroom and replaying every detail of the encounter over and over in my mind, Lieutenant Rodriguez called me into his office. He had news about Tom Whitman, and from the expression on his face, I could tell it wasn't going to be news that would help my credibility. "Hayes, sit down. I've got some information about Tom Whitman that you need to hear." I sat in the chair across from his desk, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. "Did you find him? Is he in custody?" "Michael, Tom Whitman is dead." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean he's dead? I just saw him last night. I talked to him, I shot him, I watched him float across that basement floor." His body was found early this morning by a jogger at Riverside Park, about 60 miles west of here. He was sitting on a bench near the pond, and at first the jogger thought he was just sleeping. But when she got closer, she realized he wasn't breathing. Rodriguez opened a file folder on his desk and pulled out several photographs, which he turned around so I could see them. They showed Tom Whitman's body exactly as I remembered him, the same blue work shirt, the same jeans, the same graying hair. But his eyes were closed, his mouth was shut, and his skin had the waxy pale appearance of death. According to the medical examiner's preliminary assessment, he's been dead for at least 4 days, possibly longer. The cause of death appears to be a massive coronary event, a heart attack. There are no signs of violence, no evidence of foul play. He just sat down on that bench and died. I stared at the photographs, trying to process what Rodriguez was telling me. "That's impossible. I saw him. I interacted with him. How can he have been dead for 4 days if I saw him alive last night?" "That's what we need to figure out, Michael. Because, according to the medical evidence, Tom Whitman has been dead since at least Saturday. It's now Wednesday. Whatever you experienced in that basement, it wasn't Tom Whitman." The official report, when it was finally completed 2 weeks later, stated that I had experienced a severe stress-induced hallucination, brought on by a combination of factors. The dark, confined space of the basement, the unsettling atmosphere of the abandoned house, the psychological pressure of responding to multiple disturbing calls about the same location over a period of weeks, and possible mild carbon monoxide poisoning from the old furnace in the basement. The department's consulting psychologist, Dr. Emily Foster, reviewed my case and concluded that the hallucination had been remarkably vivid and detailed due to my high stress levels and the fact that I had been working extended shifts for several weeks without adequate rest. She noted that hallucinations involving floating figures, altered appearances, and impossible physical phenomena were not uncommon in cases of severe psychological trauma combined with environmental factors like poor air quality and sensory deprivation. The cuts on my arms were explained as injuries sustained while entering the basement through the broken window. The bullet holes in the ceiling and the spent shell casings were evidence of my panic response during the hallucination. My mind had created a perceived threat that seemed real enough to justify defensive action. The department recommended that I take administrative leave and undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation and treatment program. They were concerned about my fitness for duty and wanted to ensure that I received appropriate help before returning to active police work. I took their advice, though not because I believed their explanation. I knew what I had seen, and I knew it hadn't been a hallucination. But I also knew that fighting their conclusions would only make things worse for my career and my family. For 6 months, I met with Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a police psychologist who specialized in treating officers who had experienced traumatic incidents. She was patient and understanding, never dismissing my experiences but gradually helping me to consider alternative explanations for what I thought I had witnessed. Dr. Martinez taught me coping strategies for dealing with intrusive memories and anxiety. She explained how the human mind could create incredibly vivid and convincing false memories during periods of extreme stress, and how these false memories could feel more real than actual experiences. She helped me understand that accepting the possibility that I had hallucinated the encounter didn't make me weak or crazy. It made me human. Slowly, over the course of those 6 months, I began to convince myself that maybe they were right. Maybe it had all been in my head, a combination of stress, fatigue, environmental factors, and an overactive imagination triggered by the creepy atmosphere of the abandoned house and the disturbing reports I had been hearing about it for weeks. The therapy helped. The nightmares became less frequent. The anxiety attacks subsided, and I was able to function normally in my daily life. By the end of the 6-month period, I was cleared to return to active duty, and everyone seemed satisfied that I had recovered from my traumatic experience. But there were still things that didn't add up, details that couldn't be explained by the official version of events. The smell, for instance. Even weeks after the incident, when I drove past the Whitman house, which remained empty and was eventually sold to a real estate investor who planned to renovate it, I could still detect that faint odor of death and chemicals drifting from the property. Other officers didn't smell it. Neighbors didn't report it. But every time I passed by, I caught that distinctive scent that reminded me of the basement. And there were the reports from the renovation crew that eventually began working on the house. They found things in the basement that hadn't been there when we searched it. Old tools arranged in neat rows, stains on the walls that looked recent despite being in a house that had supposedly been empty for weeks, and a section of the concrete floor that appeared to have been disturbed and then smoothed over again. Most unsettling of all were the dreams. Not nightmares exactly, but vivid, recurring dreams where I would find myself back in that basement, watching Tom Whitman arrange pieces of human skin on his workbench while humming a tune I didn't recognize. In these dreams, he would always turn to look at me with those black eyes and say, "You can't save them all, Officer Hayes. Some of them belong to us now." I would wake from these dreams with the absolute certainty that they weren't just products of my subconscious mind processing trauma. They felt like communications, like someone or something was trying to show me things that I needed to know. Dr. Martinez assured me that recurring dreams were a normal part of the recovery process and that they would fade with time. She was right about the frequency. They did become less common as the months passed, but they never completely stopped, and they never lost their vividness or their sense of being more than just dreams. 3 weeks after I returned to active duty, I got another call that sent chills down my spine. Different house, different street, but the details were eerily familiar. An elderly man living alone, neighbors reporting strange noises and sounds of distress. No response when officers knocked on the door. The address was 543 Pine Street, about 2 miles from the Whitman house. The resident was Harold Morrison, 71 years old, a retired accountant who had lived alone since his wife died 5 years earlier. Like Tom Whitman, Harold had become increasingly reclusive over the past year, rarely leaving his house and having his groceries delivered. When I arrived at the scene, I felt that same unnatural stillness in the air, that same sense of wrongness that had characterized the night at the Whitman house. The other officers on the scene, Officer Davis and Sergeant Williams, seemed oblivious to it, but I could feel it like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. We entered the house through the unlocked front door and began a systematic search. The first floor appeared normal, if somewhat neglected. Dust on the furniture, mail piled up, the kind of clutter you'd expect from an elderly person living alone. But when we reached the basement, I knew immediately that we had found something horrible. Harold Morrison was standing in the corner of his basement, his back to us, completely motionless in front of what looked like a workbench. Even from behind, I could see that something was wrong with his posture, with the way he held himself. He was too rigid, too still, exactly like Tom Whitman had been. "Mr. Morrison," Officer Davis called out. "Sir, this is the police. We need you to turn around and show us your hands." Harold began to turn, with that same mechanical, unnatural movement I had witnessed in the Whitman basement. And when he faced us, I saw those same impossible black eyes, that same slack-jawed expression, that same absence of anything recognizably human. I didn't wait to see what was on his workbench. I didn't wait to hear that inhuman clicking sound or see him begin to float above the basement floor. I turned and ran up the stairs, pushed past Officer Davis and Sergeant Williams, and ran out of the house without looking back. I got in my patrol car and drove straight to the police station, where I walked into Lieutenant Rodriguez's office and submitted my resignation letter, which I had written 3 weeks earlier and kept in my desk drawer just in case. "I can't do this anymore," I told him. "I can't keep pretending that what I saw at the Whitman house was a hallucination. There's something happening in this town, something that's targeting elderly people who live alone, and I can't be the officer who responds to these calls anymore." Rodriguez tried to talk me out of it, tried to convince me to take more time off, to undergo additional counseling, to consider a transfer to a different department. But I was done. I couldn't risk encountering another one of those things, couldn't risk having to explain another impossible experience to skeptical colleagues who would assume I was having another breakdown. I requested a transfer to the Springfield County Sheriff's Department, 40 miles away from Millbrook. I told my new colleagues that I wanted a change of scenery, a chance to work in a larger department with more opportunities for advancement and better resources for professional development. But the real reason was that I couldn't stay in Millbrook, not after what I had seen, not knowing that whatever had been inhabiting Tom Whitman's body was still active, still looking for new hosts, still collecting human skin for purposes I didn't want to imagine. The official files on both the Whitman and Morrison incidents list them as wellness checks on deceased individuals, with no evidence of criminal activity. Both men were found dead of natural causes, heart attacks, in locations far from their homes, with estimated times of death that preceded the police responses by several days. The Millbrook Police Department considers both cases closed, with no outstanding questions or unresolved issues. But I know better, because over the past 2 years I've been quietly researching similar incidents throughout New England and beyond. Late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment with my laptop and a bottle of bourbon, I search through old police reports, newspaper archives, missing persons databases, and online forums where people share stories that official channels won't take seriously. And I've found them. Dozens of cases over the past 50 years, scattered across multiple states but following the same basic pattern. Always elderly, reclusive individuals living alone. Always reports of strange noises and sounds of distress. Always police officers arriving to find the person already dead, sometimes for days, in locations far from their homes. And always, at least one officer reporting unusual experiences during the investigation. Experiences that get dismissed as stress reactions, hallucinations, or psychological episodes. Officer Janet Curtis in Brattleboro, Vermont, 1900. She reported finding an elderly woman standing in her attic with eyes that were black as coal and twice as empty, before the woman somehow vanished without using the stairs or any visible exit. The official report listed it as a stress-induced hallucination brought on by the officer's recent divorce and financial difficulties. Sergeant Mike O'Connell in Conway, New Hampshire, 1994. He described encountering a man who moved without walking, like he was sliding across the floor on invisible rails, and whose mouth opened wider than any human mouth should be able to open, revealing teeth that definitely hadn't been there a moment before. He was placed on administrative leave for a psychological evaluation and took early retirement 6 months later. Detective Lisa Park in Bar Harbor, Maine, 2003. She filed a detailed report about discovering a woman who bled black liquid that moved with purpose and made sounds that couldn't have come from a human throat, like someone had replaced her vocal cords with machinery designed to produce the most disturbing noises possible. The report was classified and sealed, and Detective Park was transferred to a different department with a promotion and a significant salary increase, essentially a bribe to keep quiet about what she had witnessed. The pattern is always the same across all these cases. The encounters are dismissed through official channels, the reports are buried or explained away, and the officers are silenced through transfers, early retirement, psychological evaluation, or, in some cases, more direct methods of persuasion. But I know what we all saw. I know what we all encountered in those basements and attics and dark corners where rational explanation breaks down. There's something out there that feeds on isolation and despair, something that seeks out people who have been forgotten by the world, who live alone and disconnected from human community. It inhabits their bodies after they die, uses them as vessels while it carries out its collecting activities, gathering human skin and arranging it with the obsessive precision of a lepidopterist mounting butterflies. And when law enforcement gets too close, when someone sees too much, when an officer witnesses something that threatens to expose the truth, it vanishes. The evidence disappears, the scene is cleaned up, and all that remains is a confused officer with an incredible story that no one will believe, and an official explanation that makes everything seem normal and rational and forgettable. I've tried to contact some of the other officers who had similar experiences, hoping to compare notes and perhaps find some pattern or weakness that could be exploited. The results have been uniformly discouraging. Officer Curtis died in a single car accident 6 months after her incident. Her vehicle left the road on a clear night with no mechanical problems and no evidence of why she would have lost control. Sergeant O'Connell passed away from a sudden heart attack at age 42, 2 years after his early retirement. despite having no history of cardiac problems and being in excellent physical condition. Detective Park moved to California after her transfer and won't return my calls, emails, or letters. Her new department says she's on extended medical leave for undisclosed reasons. Maybe they're the lucky ones. Maybe forgetting is better than remembering. Maybe ignorance is preferable to the kind of knowledge that keeps you awake at night, checking the locks on your doors and windows, jumping at every unexpected sound. But I can't forget, and I can't stop looking over my shoulder, wondering when it's going to come for me. Because I've seen him. Tom Whitman. Or the thing that wears his face. 3 times in the past month I've encountered him during my patrols in Springfield County, always at the edge of my vision, always just far enough away that I can't be completely certain it's him, but close enough that I can see those black eyes reflecting the light from my patrol car's headlights. The first time was 2 weeks ago, when I was responding to a noise complaint at a trailer park on the outskirts of Springfield. As I was walking back to my car, after determining that the noise was just a couple having an argument, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods that bordered the trailer park. Tall, wearing a blue work shirt, with gray hair, and that distinctive rigid posture I remembered so well. When I turned my flashlight in that direction, the figure was gone. The second encounter was 5 days later, at a gas station where I had stopped to fill up my patrol car during my shift. I was standing at the pump, watching the numbers roll by on the display, when I got that familiar feeling of being watched. I looked up and saw him standing across the street in the parking lot of a closed restaurant, motionless under a streetlight that seemed dimmer than it should have been. This time I didn't use my flashlight. I just stared back at him, and he stared at me, and for what felt like an eternity, we just watched each other across that empty street. Then a truck passed between us, and when it was gone, so was he. The third time was 3 nights ago, and this encounter was different. More personal, more threatening. I was at home, in my apartment on the 2nd floor of a complex that houses mostly young professionals and graduate students from the nearby college. It was around 2 a.m., and I had just finished reviewing case files for a burglary investigation I was working on. I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water before bed, and as I was standing at the sink, I saw him. He was standing in the courtyard of the apartment complex directly below my kitchen window, looking up at me. Those black eyes were clearly visible even from 2 stories up, and that slack-jawed expression was exactly as I remembered it. But this time, there was something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like he knew who I was and had been looking for me specifically. I blinked, just for a fraction of a second, and when I opened my eyes, he was gone. But the message was clear. Whatever that thing is, wherever it came from, it knows where I live. It knows where I work, and sooner or later it's going to come for me. I've been thinking about requesting another transfer, maybe to a department in a different state entirely, or perhaps leaving law enforcement altogether, going back to school and changing careers completely. Getting as far away from police work as possible, since that seems to be what attracts its attention. But I know it won't matter. Whatever I encountered in that basement, whatever was wearing Tom Whitman's face like a mask, it's not going to let me go that easily. I've seen too much, know too much, represent too much of a threat to its activities. The only question is when it will make its move, and whether I'll see it coming in time to do anything about it. 20 years on the force, and I thought I had seen everything. Murder, suicide, overdoses, domestic violence, child abuse, car accidents that turned human beings into unrecognizable masses of broken bones and torn flesh. You name it, I've dealt with it. I've seen the worst that human beings can do to each other, witnessed cruelty and depravity that would give most people nightmares for years. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I witnessed in Tom Whitman's basement that October night. The knowledge I gained there has changed me in ways that go beyond simple trauma or stress. It's changed my understanding of reality itself, my assumptions about what's possible in this world, my beliefs about the nature of life and death, and the thin boundaries between them. My fellow officers think I had a breakdown. My wife thinks I'm suffering from PTSD. My children look at me differently now, like they're not sure if Daddy is going to be okay. Like they can sense the fear that I carry with me everywhere I go. Sarah has been incredibly patient, but I can see the strain this is putting on our marriage. She suggested couples counseling, individual therapy, a vacation to help me relax and get some perspective. She means well, but how can I explain to a therapist that I'm being stalked by something that isn't human? How can I tell my wife that the reason I check all the locks twice before bed and insist on keeping a loaded shotgun in our bedroom closet is because I'm expecting a visit from a creature that wears dead people's faces? My daughter Emma is 15 now, old enough to understand that something is seriously wrong with her father, but not old enough to understand what or why. She's started asking pointed questions about my behavior, why I seem so jumpy all the time, why I installed motion sensor lights all around our house, why I won't let her walk to school alone anymore, even though it's only 3 blocks and she's been doing it for 2 years. I've told her it's just normal police caution, that working in law enforcement makes you more aware of potential dangers than most people. But I can see the worry in her eyes, the way she watches me when she thinks I'm not looking, the conversations she has with her mother in low voices that stop when I enter the room. My son Michael is 12, and he's been having nightmares that he won't talk about. When Sarah tries to get him to describe what's scaring him, he just shakes his head and says, "You wouldn't believe me anyway." I have a terrible suspicion that his dreams involve black eyes and impossible mouths full of shark teeth. That somehow my encounters with that thing have infected my family's sleep as well as my own. I've considered telling Sarah everything, the whole truth about what happened in that basement, about the other cases I've researched, about the figure I keep seeing in my peripheral vision. But what would be the point? She'd either think I was losing my mind, which would destroy our marriage and probably result in her taking the kids and leaving, or worse, she'd believe me. And if she believed me, she'd be as terrified as I am, as paranoid and sleepless and constantly looking over her shoulder. So I keep it to myself. I carry this burden alone, like all the other officers who had similar encounters and were similarly silenced. We're isolated by our experiences, cut off from the people we love by knowledge too terrible to share and too dangerous to ignore. But I know what I saw. I know what happened in that house. And I know that somewhere out there, in another small town, in another basement, some other police officer is about to discover that there are things in this world that can't be explained by logic or reason or official protocols. Things that wear human faces but aren't human at all. Things with black eyes that reflect no light and no soul. Things that collect human skin like trophies and make sounds that no human throat could produce. Things that exist in the spaces between life and death, feeding on isolation and despair, growing stronger with each person they claim, and each official report that dismisses them as hallucinations or stress reactions. I just pray that when that officer encounters what I encountered, he or she is stronger than I was, smarter than I was, better prepared for the impossible reality they're about to face. Because the truth is, I never fully recovered from that night. Part of me is still in that basement, staring into those impossible black eyes, trying to understand what I was seeing, while my rational mind screamed that none of it could be real. And part of me always will be. That's my confession. That's why I spent 6 months in therapy that didn't really help. That's why I requested a transfer to a different county and why I still wake up screaming some nights, drenched in sweat and reaching for the weapon I keep in the nightstand drawer. That's why I've installed security cameras around my house and carry my service weapon even when I'm off duty. That's why I've been quietly researching similar cases and trying to contact other officers who might have had similar experiences. Because 20 years of police work taught me that there are bad people in this world who do terrible things to innocent victims for reasons that range from greed to mental illness to simple cruelty. But what I learned in Tom Whitman's basement is that there are things much worse than bad people. There are things that aren't people at all, and they're still out there, waiting, watching, collecting. The only question that keeps me awake at night, the only question that matters anymore, is simple and terrifying. When will they come for me? And when they do, will anyone believe what really happened?